Hi, I'm Jarrad Brown, Australian expat financial planner based here in Singapore. Thank you for tuning into my video today. We've seen a lot of talk, a lot of noise about the changes to the Australian tax residency rules, and naturally there is some concern in the market and particularly in the Australian expat community. So in this video today, I would like to share with you some of the common mistakes that we see Australian expats make that could impact them being treated as a non-resident of Australia for tax purposes. So let's dive right in. Now, the first common mistake that we see being made is people frequently travelling back to Australia. Now, this is common practice, particularly if there is one partner living back in Australia, perhaps with the child or children, and one partner living offshore. And we see a lot of the Australian expat partners who are still working offshore frequently going back. And by frequently, I mean it might be every weekend, it might be every second weekend. Naturally, this may raise some flags with the ATO, particularly now that they have access to your travel data and they can obviously pick up on these things quite quickly and simply. So just be very aware of that one. It doesn't mean you need to be in Australia for 183 days. Simply the frequency of your travel may be enough to raise a red flag. The second common mistake that we see being made is people not having long-term, permanent accommodation in their country of residence. Now, if we use Singapore as a simple example, for most Australian expats, we're here on a 2-year employment pass and we have a 2-year lease on our condo or on our house that we're living in here. Now, that 2-year lease is considered permanent accommodation. By not permanent or impermanent accommodation, what I mean is, for example, a month-to-month lease or a short-term serviced apartment or even staying in a cheap hotel. It's very unlikely that tax authorities are going to accept that as permanent accommodation. So make sure that you do your homework here and consider your options. The third one, and we've seen this a little bit in the past, is people having a property in Australia that they're either renting out on a short-term basis or they're not renting it out at all, keeping a lot of their belongings in that particular house and going back and staying in it whenever they're back in Australia, particularly if that's quite a few times a year. This may be viewed in the eyes of the Australian Tax Office as you having permanent accommodation and a clear tie to Australia. So just be very wary of this one and just consider the overall impact to your tax residence. The fourth common mistake that we see being made is people maintaining their club memberships or society memberships back in Australia to things like the local bowls club or the local Rotary club without converting them to absentee memberships. Now, obviously, if we're talking about things like the MCG, for example, or back in the good old days when the club performed well, the West Coast Eagles, then in many cases, these things take a number of years to join. It's a very long waiting list. So you may have a legitimate argument for maintaining that membership, but just be sure to put it on an absentee membership. Make sure they have your overseas address on file wherever possible, because it may again signify to the ATO that it's a tie to Australia. The fifth mistake that we see being made is people not updating their address, their overseas address, with banks and share registries back in Australia. Now, you may find that the bank won't let you update it, but at least update your postal address wherever possible and update it with the share registries. As a non-resident of Australia, they should be withholding tax on any interest that you earn, or on any unfranked dividends that you receive. So very importantly, you update this one wherever possible. The sixth common mistake that we see being made is people going back to Australia and utilising Medicare whenever they're back in the country. Now, there is a rule out there, and it's stated on the website, that you can continue to utilise Medicare for up to 5 years of being out of the country. Where possible, we would always suggest that you simply avoid using it once you're filing returns or treating yourself as a non-resident of Australia for tax purposes. But again, consider your options here and avoid using it wherever possible. the final common mistake that we see people making is booking one-way tickets to Australia. This may be because they're simply not sure how long they're going to be there, or they just want to work there until the world reopens from COVID, for example. Again, this may signify that your permanent home is in Australia and not in Singapore or elsewhere offshore that you're claiming it to be. Now, in isolation, these various mistakes may not be enough by themselves to make sure that you're treated as an Australian tax resident, but again, together, you may find that they add up and tell the ATO a very different story to the one that you would like for them to be hearing. So make sure you speak to your accountant, speak to your financial planner wherever possible, do your homework, and avoid some of these common mistakes. If you have any questions at all, please do feel free to reach out to me, drop me a note in the comments. Thank you very much for tuning in.